and just welcome you guys to our webinar on webinar tactics and strategy, promotion live post game. So Julian, I'll let you start off. We can just roll with it. But
yeah, a little bit about who we are. I think most of you have heard this already, but I'm Julian. I'm Senior Strategist at Gorilla. A little bit about Gorilla, if you haven't heard of us yet. We help B2B manufacturers generate new business through marketing. That's putting it simply. If you want to learn more, you can go to gorilla76.com, read up a little more, or just ask us questions here if you want to. And Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, you guys know me. My name's Matt, Senior Strategist, Gorilla 76. And we help B2B manufacturers generate new business through marketing, but basically, help companies with their marketing strategy and driving their tactics. And webinars is one of my favorite tactics to use. It's something that is probably my favorite content piece in general to execute, because I think it's so dang versatile. It's very relational as well. And so I'm just really excited about that. Oh, thanks, Jared. Appreciate it. So let's go ahead and let's get started.
Sounds good.
Bob, welcome also.
All right, so we'll cover a few things today. We've got lots to talk about. We'll start with how to devise your webinar program, how to get started, how to promote it so the right people show up, what to do to prepare the right people for the webinar, make sure they perform well and talk well, so rehearsal and the live event. What to do after the webinar, so post-webinar tactics, without annoying anyone, without trying to sell. And then we've got some resources, like always, and some closing thoughts.
I will say, by the way, just because we're doing webinars without the intention of selling doesn't mean we're not trying to use webinars as a vehicle to drive new revenue. Completely different mindset. It all comes down to your intent. And so we are going to go through that. What's up, Blake, man? Welcome. Also, as always, especially for first timers though, questions. We love your questions. Please drop your questions in the chat at any point in time. When you have them, we will answer them. If we have a chance, we'll bring you on. But yeah, really just want to get your guys' feedback. And then, just let us know if you guys are thinking about a webinar program, if you've done something that hasn't been successful, drop us that question. We definitely want to cover that with you guys. These webinars are not useful these are much more interesting, I think, for you guys when you guys are asking questions and participating. So please feel free at any point in time to ask questions during this webinar.
All right, sure. And if you haven't joined before, we will send out a recording of this. We'll upload it to YouTube. We'll send out this deck. So no need to take frantic notes. You can just listen and drop some comments in the chat. And yes, even webinars with hard sell in the middle, they're just not fun. All right. Let's start with webinar musts. What do you have? The 4 things that you need to make sure that happens. So the first one is webinars are programmatic. So make sure you have a plan in place to do them regularly. So for us, this means doing it every 2 weeks. For some of our clients, it means doing it once a month. But the most important thing is having a plan in place for doing them regularly, because what we've learned is by doing it every 2 weeks, we're just kind of forced to do it. It's a ton of work for Matt and me, even though we don't do a ton of prep for these, and we kind of do them a little bit on the fly. They're just a lot of work with the promotion and doing this event and doing the work afterwards, and we have help. And it's a good amount of work. And if we weren't doing it every 2 weeks, it might fizzle out, and we might do it every 3 weeks or start taking longer breaks. And this way we're just kind of forced to do it, which is great. The next one is making sure you have a subject matter expert. Faking it is just gonna backfire. So make sure that whether it's you or someone at your company or a third-party expert that you bring in from outside, it doesn't have to be your company. You can just be the host and have other people share their expertise. Just make sure that what you're sharing is informational, educational, and helps people accomplish something.
I think I'll add real quick on that. This is what makes the webinar like such a good content vehicle, is because you have your subject matter expert on, and where you really get exposed on the credibility portion of it is going to be in the Q&A. You can rehearse a slide deck all you freaking want and talk through it. But once questions and answers start and people start asking you some really crispy, specific questions, that is where you are really going to look bad. So you better have your subject matter expert on, and they better be able to go through those questions. But the good part about that is that's where all the best content is. So we'll get into kind of how to devise that, but just wanted to piggyback off that for you, Julian.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, we'll go into details more later, but for all the webinars that we've done, I think the best connections always happen there, because during the presentation, you're just kind of guessing what people might want to hear. But if during Q&A, you're answering real, very specific questions, and people usually get a lot of value out of that, and it makes you shine. So it's pretty good. Do a webinar to convey value. So we already talked about this in the beginning. If you try to sell people, it's not gonna work out. People are not gonna want to show up. You know, they might show up to 2 of them if you try to sell them, but after that, they're gonna smell sales, and they're not gonna keep coming, and they're not gonna see you as an expert. They're just gonna see you as, you know, kind of annoying, who's trying to push a product on them. Instead, just convey value. Just try to be helpful. Think about who you're trying to reach and what do these people care about. What are their day-to-day responsibilities? What problems might they have? And how can you help them? And you don't need to be the expert. You can bring in other people to help them. Just make sure to provide value.
So Blake has a question. Go to the next slide. But Blake has a quick question on the programmatic element of it. Do you think monthly is frequent enough, or would you suggest start a quarterly? So I'll actually go through this own story of my own webinar evolution. So when I first started doing webinar programs, my goal was to do 1 a quarter. And it takes a lot of time to get to 1 a quarter. I'll be perfectly honest with you. Do you have off-screen support during the webinar? Yes, I do usually have like a moderator. I do want to get into that too. It's a good question, Dennis. So Blake, I did start off by doing it like once a quarter. And then quickly I realized like there's just a lot of appetite for a good webinar program. And so we eventually got it up to like once a month. And then honestly, after the pandemic hit and we started really seeing people at home, and we just thought webinars was going to be a good content play, we got at scale. We got up to 1 every 2 weeks. And so I was able to run that for like about 5 months straight, doing 1 every 2 weeks. And so we were able to actually run this entire program in like 2-week sprints. And it was interesting. I was fortunate enough to have enough subject matter experts. I didn't have to take up too many people's time. But if you're starting off, for your question, my suggestion would be to try to do it once a month. And I know that's going to sound challenging, but once a month is going to be frequent enough that you'll get people to remember that you do it with some sort of frequency. And then it'll also get you in enough practice that you'll be able to get efficient at it as you continue to do it month over month. If you do it like once a quarter, what happens is you'll push for like this, you see this timeline here, you'll push for those 3 weeks. And then you'll just kind of forget everything that you learned. And then when you want to go try to do it 2 months later, it's almost like relearning to ride a bike. And so my question is, my answer to that is once a month to me is the ideal pace to do it. And if you really see there's a lot of good audience attendance, a lot of good feedback, if you're noticing it making a difference in your sales cycle or bringing people in the sales pipeline, then elevate that and try to do it once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
And think about how often you can do it well too. I don't think it's just about frequency. Think about how often you can do it really well.
Yeah.
Like in terms of figuring out topics and getting the right people to speak to.
Yeah. So you want to go through the slide, Dennis? I see your question, Blake. I got your question too, and we're actually going to cover both of those in the next couple slides. I do want to run through them.
All right, sounds good. So here's a quick timeline for what our webinars kind of look like in terms of when we start all the way to after the webinar. So we'll start 3 weeks out, about sometimes a month out, devising the topic. So figuring out what are we going to talk about, who are we going to talk to, and who's going to be our subject matter expert, and start outlining the presentation. At that point, it can just be a few bullet points, but you at least want to know what are we going to cover so you can use that in your promotional materials, because you don't want to be vague in when you start promoting the webinar. And then set some key dates for deliverables. And by the way, all of this stuff that's in here, all of this timeline and all of the things that we'll be talking about in just a second, we have all of that templatized for one of our clients and for a few of our clients at this point, actually. And you can grab these templates. We figured we might as well share them. There's a template for a timeline where you can plop in your webinar date in the highlighted box and it'll populate everything else. There's a lot of details for when we do what and how exactly we do it. There's a copy doc where we just write all the copy up front once and then everybody can pull from it. There's Photoshop files for the images that we use to promote the webinar. So maybe valuable for you guys to get you off the ground a little sooner. If you don't have access, let me know, but this should work. And Matt, you can also drop the link in the chat if you want to. Okay, so 2 weeks before, we'll start promotion and start prep with a subject matter expert. So we're gonna ideally already have our emails written, if not draft our emails and prep the team to promote. So depends on your team structure, but designer, writer, or just yourself, make sure you start getting those assets in place to start promoting it. So like writing an email, writing copy for the ads, and so on. If you need a landing page on your website, you can go create one. We're kind of starting to do that for Industrial Marketing Live, where we have a dedicated landing page that goes a little more in depth than the Zoom registration page. If you don't have that right now, that's totally fine. I don't think it's a must. It's just like a cherry on top that makes some measurement easier and that has like an additional brand value. But otherwise, Zoom registration page is great too, and get the ad creative going. About 1 week out, get the draft of the deck ready. It doesn't need to be perfect yet, but you should have a pretty good structure so you can give some feedback and make sure that that the content is going to be good. Send back some edits and then rehearse once or twice. We're going to hit on that in a second and make tweaks. Trust your gut on that. If it feels too salesy, tell your subject matter expert or tell yourself. If it feels too long or too short or there's not enough details, talk about it and figure out how you can fix it, because the content is the most valuable thing aside from making sure the right people show up. And then start promoting the week before, ideally 2 weeks before. We'll touch on that, how to do that in a few minutes too. Then the webinar happens, go live, and afterwards we'll touch on that in detail. Engage, ask, repurpose. Do not try to sell people even after the fact. Just connect with attendees organically and authentically and try to repurpose the recorded webinar into different assets like written video and try to keep distributing. Matt, I'll let you touch on this one.
Yeah, sure. So devising your webinar program. So we think programmatically and we're thinking like, okay, how can we make multiple webinars over a certain period of time? So the way I'm thinking in this is in terms of topic. And so I like to think in series or mini series. So one of the things that I did at Binsel is we would do a series on fume extraction where we would go like beginners, intermediate, advanced. And so that was like, okay, I have 3 webinars right there. Or you could also think like in time. So you like go top wire to wire assembly tips for 2021, or, or the other thing is like get really expansive and talk a little bit about, your big ideas on how something in your industry is going to change based on a new solution coming in the market, or something that's disruptive, like 3D printing has been very disruptive for manufacturing, or additive manufacturing has really started to scale up and become more popular over the last 5-6 years. It's really gotten into a lot of different spaces that it hasn't been in before. So you could talk about how, 3D printing is going to change the casting space in the next 12 months. Like we have a client, he's actually on this webinar, who we were talking about that in terms of metal casting. And so that was a very interesting point. You can get expansive and sort of talk about that if you have enough subject matter expertise to talk on it, or if you know someone in your space you can bring them on as a guest to talk about it. I do think that stuff is very interesting. Thinking in contrast is another one. So in the welding space, for instance, like air-cooled versus water-cooled welding, this is a very popular topic in the robotics industry, especially because, there's 500 amp air-cooled robotic welding, and then there's 500 amp water-cooled robotic welding. And so it's like, well, which one is right for me? It's not always cut and clear. And so you can definitely talk about the sort of contrasting topics to go like, okay, here's scenarios where it's good for you. Here's scenarios where it's not. With water-cooled welding, you're talking about more consumable life. Air-cooled welding is definitely easier to set up and faster, but there's definitely pros and cons to both. And so you can definitely talk about them. And so contrast to me, always a good topic. In-depth proprietary research. If you're company has an R&D component to it? Or do you have like an engineering manager who's running prototype testing on something or something of that nature? These are great things to document and work with your subject matter expert in that area and say, hey man, let's kind of talk about what we've learned doing R&D on remote laser annealing or some other topic, robotic fume extraction. And then you talk about your findings. So you'll go ahead and go deep into R&D and then reporting on your findings is sort of like an in-depth industry report. Like that's always very interesting. You always will get a lot of people that will be interested in that. And then audience style. So got a question here about from Dennis about, an office hours with the expert. That's like AMA style. Yes, that is absolutely a possibility for you to do. I typically would go that route after I had established my credibility doing something a little bit more traditional. And so, go through this mini series thing, like do the beginner's immediate advanced and then build topics off of that. And then after that, you establish enough credibility with your subject matter expert that you can do an AMA. And so that's how I would think about when's a good time to do an AMA.
Do you have an intruder, Matt?
I do have an intruder. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So that's how I think of devising webinar programs. So when I've done it for Binzel, I've thought in terms of like a mini series. I've thought in terms of like, what can I do that I can do it about 4 or 5 different ways to cut that topic up and then get into it with my subject matter expert. It's also good and preferable if you can use the same subject matter expert for those things, because you're trying to talk a little bit to Matthew's point, you're trying to establish their credibility just as much as your company's. And so when you have the same person on all the time, you really build them up as an expert. I did that a lot with Etienne when I was at Binzel, and he was our fume guy. And basically now he's doing other webinars with industry associations. He has a dealer network that wants him to do webinars. And so when you're able to do it for your company and bring people in, then all of a sudden your subject matter expert becomes a trusted source in the market on that topic. And then that allows them to expand their reach on behalf of your company, which is why I think all that stuff is very useful. I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna do this really quickly and then get her out of here 1 second. You can cover this slide, Julian.
Will do. All right. So to go off of what Matt said. So pitch your subject matter expert well ahead of time. I think we got one question from, let's see here. I think we got one question from Matthew to, will you cover how to engage SMEs and how to provide value to them so they will benefit from being there? From my perspective, I would pitch this to them as similar to going to a conference, because depending on how many people show up, you have 30 to up to 100, I think, webinar, Matt, we had for one of our clients of the right people show up to the webinar, and the salesperson gets to be the subject matter expert to the 100 people that he's trying to sell to already. So I think that's probably how I would pitch it to him. If he or she is active on LinkedIn, they'll also get some content out of it. But I think it's a really great way for the subject matter expert, if they're a salesperson, or I guess it might be a different story if they're not a salesperson. But
well, even if it's your key accounts person too, like if you have someone who's focused on an industry, like a lot of people who have account-based sales because they do stuff like we're focused on automotive or we're focused on the ConAg industry, and you can basically segment your list to that industry and get your key accounts person in front of that audience. Really good way to build their subject matter expertise with them. So it's another good way to think about it. So if you want to go to your subject matter expert and get them involved and say, hey man, instead of you trying to go knock on, how many people can your guy get in front of every week? They can get in front of maybe 10 to 15 tops if they're out on the road every single day and then coming home on Friday to do office work. You can, if you have a good enough list and you know how to promote, you can get 100 to 200 people on a webinar at one point in time, so we can present to all of them at the same time. And the best part about that is the live event is really where people start to ask the questions, and he or she really gets to establish the subject matter expertise like in real time in front of those people, and then that person becomes a trusted source of information for exactly the thing that you're trying to sell out in the market. And he doesn't even have to actually sell to establish that. And so that's kind of the magic of the webinar, when you're able to execute it with no sales intent to convey value and you have the right subject matter expert in place. So to devise your webinar program, the first 1 to 2 webinars are always going to be messy. There's always going to be a technical problem. There's always going to be I don't know how to handle this with the control panel. There's always going to be people are asking questions in the chat panel instead of the questions panel. How do I handle that? It's going to happen. It's cool. Enjoy the process. Like it's not a problem to, oh, thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. So it is definitely, some things will go wrong and you will be able to get through them. They're a much bigger deal to you as the moderator than they probably are to your audience. The other thing I would recommend is to keep it simple. So no bells and whistles. The first webinar I ever did, we tried to put in polls. We tried to do a video in the middle of it. And it was a mess. Like the webinar program crashed on us. And then I had to go back in. We lost like half the audience, and I had a backup moderator in, thank goodness, who had to pick it back up and hand it off. And it was just a mess. And I was just like, we're not going to do it that complicated going forward. So if I were you, I would keep it so super simple to start. Don't try to put polls in. You can do that. Don't try to put video in unless you can do it safely, like, embed it in the slide deck or something like that. Don't try to do something where you're toggling to YouTube to go try to show a video. That's just going to add a layer of complexity that you probably are not prepared for. And then another thing that a lot of people ask is like, well, what about live streaming or live demoing a product? Totally great idea. If you work in the hardware's business and you want to showcase your product in real time, that's a great thing for an AMA, by the way, is have an AMA with the live demo and see if you can actually execute it. But I would get the basics done first, right? Like I would get the basics under your belt before you try to do something more advanced. And so that's definitely my suggestion when it comes to the live stream. It's something a lot of people were interested in. Same with like virtual events, but I would get the basics done first before getting into more advanced. Add stuff as you get efficient, as I said.
All right, promotion and prep. So we talked a little bit about this a few slides ago, but prepare your subject matter expert to be on camera. It adds to the experience. So what I like to do is just rehearsing a few times. So this third bullet point here, but try to rehearse it at least once and try to get a feel for how they are on camera. And if you need a second rehearsal, that's great. I think what's great is running through the script, if there is a script, or running through the slide decks a few times and making sure that the presenter is going to be very comfortable with what they're planning to say, so they can deviate off script and take questions, and it's not going to throw them off too much because they're already very comfortable with what they're going to say. And yeah, just make sure you get the slide deck in good shape. Again, like Matt said, keep it simple. We don't get very fancy with our slide deck. It's just bullet points and a few thoughts, but we try to keep it clean, not too much text and nothing crazy going on visually. Just make it easy to consume. I think making it really nice is kind of the cherry on top, but if it's not easy to read and to get through, then it just makes things a lot harder. Promotional strategies. So this is a big one. How do you get the right people to show up for the webinar? Email is a big one for us. For this webinar right here and for all the other ones, email is usually our biggest driver of registrations because we just have a good and engaged email list of 4,000 or 5,000 marketers in the industrial space. So we try to send at least 2 emails. We always get that done. The first email we send out like a week before, the second email a day before, and we usually try to tell a little bit of a story. We try not to just, list the topics, even though, if you don't have the time, that might be sometimes the faster solution, but we try to tell a little bit of a story of why this matters, this thing that we're talking about. Matt's done a lot better job at this than I have in the past. So the last emails you're seeing have come from Matt. Second email, we try to send like a day before, sometimes a few days earlier. Just kind of depends on what works for you. You can play around with different timings and see if it makes any difference. If you have the time, you can do the bonus email like 15 minutes before. When you just open up the webinar, you can send out an email that just says the lobby is open. Just a word of caution on that. Maybe I think it's worked really well for us so far. I think we've only done it once. Saw really good open rates and seemed like people weren't annoyed by the third email. I've done it for another client and maybe it was just poorly executed, but A lot more people unsubscribed than on the other emails. And, we might have been annoying on the third email. So just try to do well, try not to be pushy and see what happens. And if people are not responding well, maybe leave the third email off. And if people are responding really well, keep doing it.
Got a question from Blake, and we're going to cover this on the next slide. But if you don't have a good email list, this is actually a challenge for some people. It's like, I don't have a lot of people on my list, so it's hard to get attendees. So we can go to the next slide, I think, and cover that.
Mm-hmm. You want to touch on this one?
Yeah. Let's touch on this. So like, the first thing is on that email, where do you kind of send it to the promotional email? I would always recommend doing an A/B test, just because I think A/B testing, you get a chance to see what copy resonates with people more. So Khalid Saleh on LinkedIn, if you guys don't know him, there's his name down there. He owns a company that does conversion rate optimizations called Invest. Maybe we'll have him on this webinar one day. Let's talk about that. That'd be interesting. But he always tests like copy, and he tests big ideas. So it's like logo, let me talk about something different here. Let me talk about more about my company instead of a little bit more of a story about the topic. And so you can see on like when you test copy, like big ideas like this, like the lift in conversion optimization was huge, like 49%. So when we're talking about testing copy, don't do it like, let's test having a CTA button here in another color. Let's talk about like big ideas with the copy and what we want to communicate to people. I mean, the one that did not have the CTA in this example did almost 50% better. So CTA isn't the end all be all. It's actually having something engaging to read for people when you're trying to promote your webinar. All right, so if you don't have a big email list, that is okay. Or if you have no list, that is also okay. There are ways around this to help you guys promote. And so I'll walk through a couple of these. Or this is actually your slide, Julian. Do you want to walk through it?
Yeah, I can. You can. If you feel strongly about it, I'll throw this to you. Okay. So do you want to touch on this first one, Matt? The measure of success is attendance rate.
Yeah. So to me, like, it doesn't matter whether you have 30 people registered or 300 people registered. To me, the most important sign of success is your attendance rate. And so that's essentially the ratio of people who register versus attend. And so I always benchmark, and your benchmarking will be different. You'll have to basically run your own webinar program to see this. But my benchmark at Binzel was 50%. I have a client right now, and their benchmark is about 55%. MJ Peters, who was on our last webinar, and I know she runs a lot of webinars at Firetrace, and depending on her segment, it's different. So when she's running it to end users, her attendance rate's about 40%. When she's doing it to her dealer network, it's about 20%. So your benchmark is going to depend very, very much so on who you're targeting, what their schedules look like, because not all of them are just able to attend webinars like this. But essentially, you're going to run a couple, and then each one will benchmark the other, essentially. So that first webinar, let's say you get 25%. Okay, that's my benchmark. Can I do better? And then your next one goes 35%. Okay, now you're averaging that together, and then you're going to basically run that as your new benchmark. And so always just benchmark yourself and just judge on whether or not you're able to meet or exceed that benchmark. And that, to me, is the sign of success, not volume. Your executives like to see volume, but for you, you need to be focused on the ratio. And that's ultimately where you're going to be able to make improvements.
All right. Second point is try to find someone who already has a big list, who already has a big audience. So there's a few ways to do this. The trade organizations are a good one. Sometimes you have to buy yourself access to their audience. There might be sister companies in your organization that you can work with, or a strategic partner, or someone who serves the same audience, really anyone that serves the same audience as you do, who can add some value to those people and is not a competitor. I've seen some people bring on competitors as well. It's more of a bold strategy. It could certainly work, but I would start by looking for people, and you probably already know them, who are trying to sell to the same people as you are, and try to bring them on and have them provide value. And what they will do in return, you'll bring them on, you'll put them in front of the people that they're trying to sell to, and in return, they will most often promote the event to their list. They'll promote it through their organic LinkedIn, where they might have a lot of followers. So we've successfully done that a few times, and we've also sponsored some emails with trade publications, and we'll touch on how that all compared on the next slide, I think.
I'd say one more thing to add to this also is the micro influencer network. So if there's influencers in your space on Instagram or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, there's like groups that you can go to on Facebook to try to promote your webinar, go for it. If there's influencers you can build relationships with on Instagram and then ask them to come on and do a joint webinar with you, do it. That will leverage that their whole list will help leverage it for you. So I would say get creative, go find people that can help drive your attendance rate up. The joint venture op works really well at Gravy. This was a big strategy for us because we didn't have a great email list. And so we would go to other companies who had big lists and we would try to JV webinars with them. And it worked out really well. We were like 4 for 4 pitching this idea to them. And really it was just on the back of Gravy having a really good LinkedIn presence, even though they had a really bad email list. And so if you have other things that you're very competent in that you can leverage as a way to pitch for a webinar, then do that. And so we had a question from Blake here on the joint ventures, whether it's a one-off pitch or a series pitch to them. I would start with the one-off pitch just because typically that's going to be the level of investment they'll be willing to make. I would try to identify a few different people you could joint venture with. That'll help build your email list too. The secret to doing this, by the way, is offer to do all the work for them. Okay. So say, look, we'll host the webinar. We'll do the things on the platform. We'll develop the slide deck. We'll make the slide deck and we'll just edit it with you. All you guys have to do is just show up and talk. And so the easier you can make it for them. Now, smart ones will be like, no, I kind of want to I want to keep the webinar. I want to keep the webinar platform. But for a lot of people who aren't thinking about it, you're getting all the upshot of that because you're going to get that email list and you're going to get all their registrants in your CRM and then be able to go back to them with your future webinar series. And so Blake asked a question about one-off pitch or series pitch. I would start with a one-off pitch. If they like it, then go back to them, try to do it again. But I would have a few people, I would try to ID a few people to run that joint venture series with. That's at Gravy, we did it with different companies. So we definitely went to Drift. Drift said yes. We went to Customer Gauge. They said yes. We went to Churn Zero. They said yes. And so you can go to other companies in your space who maybe do something like this slide says complimentary, or even something that is like within the sphere of what you guys do and pitch it, especially if they have and look at things like their followers on LinkedIn or things like that for clues of whether they have a good list or not. And then at that point, you're off and running. I mean, so if you have no list, that's the way that I would do it. And that's what I would recommend doing. We have a question from Meredith. And so I wanted to read this off. In your opinion, would it be too much or overkill to do a quarterly webinar or a bi-monthly webinar in combination with a podcast that also happens bi-weekly/monthly? Would you choose one format over the other from the beginning?
Oh, am I up?
Yeah, you're up. I asked the question to you.
Yeah. Okay. So I would definitely pick one. I think if you try to do both, you're probably going to half-ass both a little bit. I would rather pick one that suits you best and suits your needs best and double down on that. Do it really well. And maybe it'll be hard to test a podcast. You can definitely test a webinar and see how that lands. It'll be hard to test a podcast, but I would think about your strengths. For a podcast, you will need a strong host, someone who's good at interviewing. You're going to have more one-on-one interviews and do it more frequently. So your reach initially is going to be smaller. For a webinar, you can reach a lot more people more quickly. They're more time to set up. They're not as frequent. And you're going to need a subject matter expert to talk about a topic. It's less of an interview like a podcast is. So I don't know. You just kind of have to weigh your option. And Matt, I'd love to hear your take on this too. And think about where is your strength going to be and what is your audience going to appreciate more? What is the right format for you? And double down on that.
So I'm going to differ from Julian on this. I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing both. I would do the webinar and then make the webinar into a podcast, if that's at all possible. So take your webinar recording and then just repurpose it a little bit on the front end. So just cut off the intro and then just, record a separate intro for the podcast. And then you can just take your webinar and launch it as a podcast. That's personally what I would do if I had the bandwidth for it. But my feeling is if I were to do one or the other, I'd probably go with the webinar just because there's a more human to human relational aspect to it that I think cannot be replicated with the podcast. Podcast is more passive listening. audience building, stuff like that. But I would, if I could, do the webinar, repurpose into a podcast. That to me is the best play possible if you have the bandwidth to execute it.
Okay, promotion and prep. So we talked a little bit about email, and we already got some questions about, okay, what do we do if we don't have email? We talked a little bit about getting on someone else's email list, but these are some other options that you could do. Facebook and LinkedIn. So you can, just like you would with any other thing, you can run a link click ad where you send people to the registration page on Facebook and LinkedIn. Just play around with it and see where you can reach your people that you need to reach best, most efficiently. Organic social. So you can post this stuff on LinkedIn on your company page. If you've got a good amount of followers, the people who are running the webinar or the people in your company that have a good following from the people that you're trying to reach, try to leverage their profiles. Maybe don't try to pre-write the post for them and give them everything. Maybe give them some snippets they can use or some images. But I think ideally a more authentic post would be best, kind of written by them in their own words, why people should join, and sharing that on their LinkedIn profiles. I think this is pretty interesting to me because I always wonder about this, and it's actually the first time I pulled these numbers and compared them. This is just a comparison of registration costs that we've seen, and with a word of caution at the end. So email and LinkedIn are always going to be your best channels, I think, if you have them available, because they're free. So email, our main driver of registrations. On LinkedIn, Matt's very active there. He's been driving a good amount of registrations from there. Obviously, his time to write the post, but we're not paying for the ads there. And it's also a channel that keeps compounding, whereas the ads, you turn it off and the registrations don't keep coming anymore. Whereas on LinkedIn Organic, you kind of build a following, you build an audience, and the more you do it, the more you'll get out of it. On LinkedIn ads, we've seen $26 to $31. Just pulled some numbers from some of our clients. So it's about the range. It can be higher, just depending on who you're targeting and your messaging. Just kind of depends. On Facebook, we haven't done a ton of webinar ads here, but we're kind of at $33. It could be lower, probably. It could be higher, depending on, again, who you're targeting. What we tried recently that was very interesting was a sponsored email with a trade publication where it was a super small audience and they were very hard to target through paid. We didn't have an email list, but there was an industry publication that had a segmented list for these people. We paid $1,500 for 3 emails, and they sent it out to that list. And we actually drove a lot of registrations, and we paid $20 per registration. The thing that performed best so far, which I love because it was kind of a lucky find, was a LinkedIn group, which not a lot of people use LinkedIn groups because they're, unlike Facebook groups, I don't see a lot of activity in them, and they're not served up on my feed a whole lot on LinkedIn. So I'm not sure if it's a good organic strategy, but what you can do is find a good group on LinkedIn that has the right people that you're trying to reach. And you need to manually check that, make sure it's not flooded by sales and marketing people trying to pitch these people. And if it's a good group with a good size, what you can do is reach out to the admin and see if he or she will pin your post. This is what we did here. We just posted an organic post to that group and had it pinned. And what happens is it sends out a notification to all group members, in this case, like 15,000 people. And we paid $250 for it, and we drove $9 registrations from it. So that was pretty cool. But what you should be measuring, and Matt touched on this a little bit earlier, is the cost per qualified attendee. So, for example, from this pinned post, about half of them were not qualified people, which sucked. There were a lot of researchers, a lot of PhD students. So, the list of the cost of qualified registration is actually 18, and then I didn't go into how many attended. But if only a fourth of them attended, then that cost goes up further. And on LinkedIn, email and LinkedIn, that looks very different. Lots of high quality attendees. So that's what you really need to be comparing. Just because this is $9 doesn't mean it's the best. Although my gut tells me, and the data that I've looked at is this is pretty hard to beat, but also kind of a unique find. So all things to think about. Matt, you want to touch on this one?
Yeah, so this is an example of like doing the organic LinkedIn thing. And so this is a perfect example of someone who is like building suspense and curiosity versus someone who's looking for the ends. And so these are different people entirely. I've worked with both these people. They'll forgive me for using them as an example here. But so you have Derek on the left side here, just building a little bit of suspense. Ever wonder what it would be like for X, Y, Z? Well, we're going to finally talk about this. This was an AMA style, gave the date. And then the other thing that was interesting about this was that he did not put the link in the post itself. He put it in the comments, or he actually just asked people to like +1 it in the comments, and you see what happened there, like 99 comments, 72 people engaging with it, as opposed to Jim. And I love Jim, and Jim's a super talented guy. But it was just more so kind of the ends. It was like, here's your last chance to attend the webinar, but no suspense, no curiosity building. So it's important when you're trying to get your team to promote the webinar. And really the big thing, once you guys take away from this here, is they actually have to build a little suspense and curiosity, a little bit of storytelling, just a little bit of like, why do I even want to attend this? And so you'll notice that a little bit on the email that we I think sent yesterday. But on top of that, like when your team is doing this, like, don't just ask for the ends of the registration, like, give them a little bit behind, like, like put some excitement behind it. And then I think you'd find you'll get a lot better engagement and results for it. These are unfair things to compare a little bit though. Like Jim has 700 followers and Derek has 5,000. So there's a lot more just to it than simply that. But that said, the style that Derek wrote it in is something that will draw you in a lot more than what Jim is. And I think that's the key takeaway I want you to take from this. All right, let's move through, because we're like 40 minutes in and we got a lot to cover here. Yeah. All right, so rehearsal is a major key. Your SME is probably not experienced doing webinars. Your job is to make them think about talking and nothing else. So you want to handle everything on the back end, the moderation, handling guests, doing all of that. Audio is critical, so get them a decent microphone, just like this. And then a webcam is expected. Be human at all times. So Julian and I always do this on camera. Julian actually left his house to go to the office to do this because his internet sucks so much, and he wanted to make sure that he could be on camera for you guys. So webcam is expected. Be human at all times. And you'll see there'll be just a big lift in engagement, people paying attention to you. It also just breeds some familiarity. So when they see your subject matter expert on LinkedIn, maybe share a clip that you make out of this, they'll recognize that. It gives you a lot more flexibility. So like these to me are major keys. So I would make sure, rehearsal is a big thing. We can go to the next slide because I have more stuff on rehearsal. Rehearsal pitfalls. When you go through rehearsal here, do I use any audio enhancements like lighting? I do actually. I have a ring light on right now. It's $20 and my webcam's attached to it. The webcam was like $100, but honestly, I've seen computers that have cameras that are just as good as the external one that I'm using here, which kind of makes me angry because there's one thing that Macs don't have is good built-in cameras, but PCs actually aren't bad. But yeah, ring light I think is definitely a good investment. That's something I'm using right now. $20, easy to set up. Really easy way to just look a little bit better on camera. So thank you, Mary, so much for that question. So rehearsal's pitfalls to snuff out. When you go through rehearsal and you do an actual dry run, you're going to hear your subject matter experts use these words, and they are nails on a chalkboard, guys. Like avoid saying the stuff and idea. So when your SME uses language like customer or client, us or we in talking about your company or your company's name, try to avoid overusing that, because that is kind of a bit of a turnoff, because you get too much into product features when you do that. The key is when you're doing your webinar, you want to talk about your audience problems, not the way that, not what you guys do and your features and your benefits of your solution. And so use stories to flesh out some key points. And what you should do instead, I hope this is on the next slide. If it's not, I'll talk about it. You can go to the next slide, Julian. Focus instead on your category. So instead of saying Abacore Benzels, focus on fume extraction. Instead of saying Gorilla 76, focus on industrial marketing. Instead of saying Batesville products, talk about permanent mold metal casting or perm mold metal casting. Hi, Tim. And then also talk about your specific target audience. Talk about design engineers, production managers, manufacturing executives. Avoid using customer or client. Talk exactly to the people who you invited to the webinar, because when they hear their title, when they hear their roles and responsibilities, you immediately make your content more relevant. And so to me, like, use this language instead of that turnoff language. That turnoff language is going to keep people from engaging. It's going to it's going to make them tune out, and it's not going to bring them back to the next webinar. So these are, when you are moderating this as the marketing person, be looking for this kind of stuff and snuff it out. Other points of emphasis here: throw them questions they haven't had prepared. So I always try to do this with my clients. It's like when we're doing webinars and like I hear them presenting, so you should be actively listening during this. Just start throwing out random questions to them, like things you hear, and like it's okay to play dumb. Like when you hear something and you don't know it, just say, hey, can you explain what this means to me? I don't know what that is. Because you know what? It's easy when you live it every day to assume everyone knows the language you talk about, but it's actually not the case. And so the way you really shine on webinars is to get really expansive on basic talking points and talk about it in a way that your audience can fully understand. There's just a lot of assumption, I think, that people understand what you're talking about. So when you play dumb and ask those basic questions, it also helps your subject matter expert really shine, because the more basic and kind of open-ended you get with your cues to your subject matter expert, the more they'll expand upon it. And you're like, oh my God, where did that come from? Like, that is such an amazing answer. And so you just kind of jot that down and you're like, all right, let's keep that one for next time. And like, hey, let's make sure we hit on that story that you guys told, where you kind of fleshed that out and brought that to life in a way that people understood. So bank those questions, have them ready. Invariably, you hopefully will not have to use them, but it's good to have them anyway, just to break up and do pattern disruption. Identify cringeworthy talk, cliches. We did one webinar one time where my guy said at the end of the webinar, it's not whether you need it, but can you afford not to have it? And I was like, and I just went like this immediately, like that was a horrible thing to say. And so we all felt really bad after saying that and decided we would never use cliches like that again. And so avoid cliches and avoid thinly veiled sales talk. All right, it's game day, y'all. All right, so do the basics so you don't trip yourself up. So this sounds really stupid to say, but this is actually things that happen, and I've seen it happen to people. Use the bathroom, have water available because you'll get dehydrated. Lock your office door like I have right now because my kids are trying to open it. Turn your phone off and put your office phone on do not disturb, because the last thing you want to do is get called by a salesperson while you're doing it. And shut your email down. So like, don't have people trying to ping you while you're doing this webinar and like, being two places at once. You want to avoid that. Get on 20 minutes early with your subject matter expert. Make sure that everything is working correctly, that their webcam is good, that they're nice and phototelegenic, that their microphone is working properly. That, all of that stuff is just working. So give yourself that 20 minutes to, just get started. 5 minutes before the webinar, go live. So we go live like 10 minutes, but 5 minutes to me is the minimum of what you should be doing. Hype the content. Like I do this with Julian all the time. We just try to talk to you guys like, hey, tell me where you're from. Tell me what your company does. Tell me a little bit about what you do. Like, engage your audience immediately. Ask some icebreakers and have conversations with them. And then when they give you answers, you can end up building off of that. It's like, oh, tell me a little bit about that. So encourage questions repeatedly. So I do this constantly with you guys, and we're doing this like, please ask your questions. We love your questions. Your questions definitely test us, challenge us, and it really helps sort of expand upon the content. And then always use welcoming language, make people feel like they're at home here, that it's a really good safe space for them to learn and to help them do their jobs better. So always be conveying that value. So those first 5 minutes are critical, because the last thing you want to do is be doing this. It's awkward, right? Like nobody likes that. So, try
to keep you moving on that one.
So try to break it with just some talk. You want to make sure you prepare people for what you're going to talk about, engage with them, and, encourage questions repeatedly. Once you're live, pattern disruption is key. So when a contextual question is asked, interject. We do this all the time. Mary just asked a question about audio visual enhancements like lighting right after I talked about rehearsal. Perfect question, contextual, brought her up immediately. No need to wait till the end, just bring it. Encourage questions all the time, like I just said, in the chat, in between slides, whatever. And then your goal and this is a little counterintuitive. This is everything that I tell my clients as well. You should get to the Q&A as fast as humanly possible while giving a substantive presentation, because ultimately people are less interested in my slide deck and they're way more interested in getting their questions answered. And so what you want to do is create a webinar slide deck. I'm struggling with the word substantive. You want to create a webinar slide deck of substance and make sure people's brains get working a little bit, and then invite those questions. And then what happens is the Q&A becomes honestly the best part of the webinar. So that's ultimately where you're trying to get people to, is get into the Q&As as fast as possible, which is why the person who asked earlier about whether the AMA works really well, it does, but you have to have enough subject matter expertise and build enough following to get there. But like the AMA is where it's at. I mean, the second half of your webinar, that Q&A basically becomes the AMA. And so if you do your webinar right, you get to have the slide deck to convey value, and then you get the second half as kind of an AMA. And that's where you get a chance to expand upon the topic, go outside of the topic, and ultimately create a better experience as a result. We can go to the next slide. So again, the audience all of a sudden just turns on. They become really engaged during the Q&A. And so whatever you do, don't stop momentum. So this happens. I've seen people do this all the time where it's like, oh, we have 45 minutes scheduled. I want to respect time. And so let's go ahead and bounce out. Who cares about that? Like, if people want to stay longer than 45 minutes to get their question answered, invite it. And then the one thing I like to do while I'm doing that is, like, when I see the big list of questions that I have from people, I'll go like, Steve, Nicole, Richard, Tim, Todd, I see you guys' questions. We're going to get to them. We're going to get to them in that order, right? So make sure people know you got that question and that you're going to get to it during the course of the webinar. Whatever you do, don't stop momentum. Call them by name. Make sure their questions are great. Usually you can always tell it's a really, really good question, because your subject matter expert will go, oh man, that's a great question. And then they got to take a minute to sort of just think about it. And then it's very common when you do your webinar. This has happened to me when I did them at Binzel. This happens to me with clients that I do webinars with. It's very common for the same 2 to 3 people to ask multiple questions. This means they are self-qualifying you, because there's always this great progression, right? They'll ask a very basic question. They'll go like, how would you do AskCast inserts for this? And then the next person asks, do you guys do AskCast inserts? And then the next question is, what are your office hours? And it's just hilarious, like how people will kind of just start self-qualifying it through this progression of questioning. And so pay attention to that when you're doing the webinar, because those are the people that you may want to ask a different follow-up question to when you do the follow-up that you want to do to not annoy your attendees.
Talking about you, Blake. We're going to pitch you later.
All right. You go ahead, roll with that post game.
All right, webinar post game, follow-up email. So we try to get out the follow-up email with a recording and the deck from the webinar the same day if possible. I don't think we've ever accomplished that, but we would like to. If not that, we try to get it out first thing the next day, because people are always waiting for it. People are usually asking for it. Are you going to send out the recording? Are you going to send out the deck? And interestingly, this is I just thought about this for the first time also, but on a lot of our YouTube videos, we get 2, 3, 4 times the views that we will have attendees in the webinar, which is kind of crazy. 3 times the people are watching our YouTube videos than compared to who's attending the webinar. So there's a ton of value in sending out the recording. What we also do in the follow-up email, you guys have seen this before, but we invite people to the next webinar. We already have that schedule out. We don't have an outline yet at that point, but we have the topic. We kind of know what we want to talk about, which you'll see in a second. And we have a soft sell close. We don't try to pitch anyone on our product, but we do offer, if you are looking for help, or we can point you in the right direction, let us know, and we're happy to answer questions. And sometimes we'll get a couple of questions coming back, and those might not turn into anything in the beginning, but give it some time, and those people might end up becoming customers for you. And all you did was help. You never try to sell them. Do the content waterfall from the webinar content. So what we do is, like I said, we upload the video recording to YouTube as soon as possible. What we do is just chop off the ends of where we make small talk. We just make sure the video jumps right into the content. We take some clips out of it, although we haven't done a good job of using them, but we make some video clips, some audio clips of some certain points that Matt or I talked about that we think are good for people to know. And we share that on LinkedIn. You can also think about using them in ads if that makes sense for you. You can put out a written blog post or more from a webinar if you have it well planned. I know, Matt, you guys are doing that on a few clients or planning to do that on a few clients.
Yep.
And then you make sure, don't just do the content waterfall for the sake of having a ton of content. If you're going to do it, make sure you actually use it and get it in front of the right people. Because if you don't do that, the content waterfall is kind of worthless. You got to make sure the right people see it.
This is my distribution look right here. You got to
listen to Matt's podcast on the manufacturing executive. He talks in detail about that. Attendee follow-up. Not going to beat a dead horse, but don't pitch people. Instead, what we do is we work with a freelancer. We give them some information about people's names and the companies they work at, and what they give us back. What they give us back is like a list of LinkedIn profiles, and just makes it a lot faster for us to connect with you. And all we do is in the connection request, we might say, do you have any feedback for us? Because we're truly interested in hearing that. We want to make sure that we do a good job in these webinars. And if there's something you hate, like us not reading questions out loud, we want to know that. And if there are any topics you care about that we should cover, we want to know that. So that's all we try to do. And Matt, you want to touch on territory salesperson?
Yeah. So I think if you have your territory salesperson, that you want to make sure they get in touch with, the person who actually does the webinar should be the first person to go connect with them. So have your SME connect with the person, the moderator should do it. And then, when you do that webinar feedback, just again, ask what you could do better, any topics of particular interest to them. And then what you do, have your territory salesperson connect with them after. It's very natural for that because ideally you would engage with that person later. And then run that same play that I just talked about, where you have your next webinar, have your territory salesperson, invite them personally to the webinar and say, hey, I know you attended our first one with Matt and Julian, or Matt and whoever subject matter expert is. We're doing another one. I really hope you can make it. Hope to see you there. Anything I can answer for you about it, just let me know. And so again, soft sell, prioritize relationship building, and then your sale opportunity will come. I always approach marketing as if, people have their own timelines. Did you hear my kid crash against the door there?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great.
As if people buy on their own timelines. And so if you respect people's timelines and just try to provide value all the time, eventually when they actually are in a buying mode, you will be the person that they think of. And so that is how I approach marketing, and I trust that process, and it has worked well for me in my career. For question heavy attendees, like those same people.
That's actually impressive. That's a lot of strength.
I'm kind of afraid she's hurting herself. So I may need to bounce here for a second just to check that. For question heavy attendees, ask if there's more you can do to help. So that person who is self-qualifying themselves, you can go a little more forward there, right? I mean, you be contextual. Say, hey, I noticed you asked a lot about this particular thing in the webinar, and I'm wondering if there's anything in particular about that question that I can answer for you in a little more detail. I'd be happy to hop on a call with you, or we can just do this over email or LinkedIn, whatever it is. But, obviously, don't be a robot about this. You will make decisions based on what happens in real life here. And so, go through those questions and pick up on the people who are really engaged with you, and you can have a different conversation with them than the people who are just sitting back and just listening to us.
Don't automate it. Direct mail, Matt, I'm going to let you hit on this one too.
All right. So I did this a little bit of gravy, and I loved this tactic. So get super, super relational. So dive into your CRM if you have it, and go find your attendees. They'll be in your HubSpot, they'll be in your Salesforce, you'll have addresses for them. And if it's a really key account or someone who you really want to do more business with, a handwritten note goes a long, long way. Maybe a little piece of swag with that handwritten note. So just dig in with your CRM. Your goal is to delight people and make them feel good about, being part of your webinar. You can do something even really small, like you can send them a little piece of branded swag if you want, maybe a little beanie cap, or you can even do something like make a donation to a local food bank or something in their name, or anything like that to kind of convey value and just show you care, put a big human touch as a thank you for the webinar. I don't think you have to do that for all attendees necessarily if you don't have budget for that, or if it's just a lot of work, but go through and find the really key people that you want to make sure you're keeping their attention, and do something and go a little above and beyond with something super relational like that. And so that to me is a way you can really, really stand out and a way that you can really, really do something memorable and make them feel not just like they got value out of the webinar, but make them feel good about the fact that they were part of that with you. And so that to me is where doing something like a little direct mail play afterwards, even though it's a little more extra work, can really go a long way. All right. So that was it, man. Thank you guys so much. Here's the resources. Here's some of my favorite webinar platforms, by the way, in case we get this question. Zoom, GoToWebinar. Those are the easiest ones to use. They're everywhere. They integrate with HubSpot and other CRMs really well. Demio, our good friend, or my good friend, Ashley Levesque, is the director of marketing for Demio. Demio is a great product. I've heard really good things about it, even though I haven't used it. And then eWebinar, if anyone on here does a lot of training, eWebinar is a very new platform, but it's essentially an automated only webinar system where you can put a live component in. And it's a pretty new product, but it's designed for people who do a lot of trainings or a lot of like things where they're constantly having to do it over and over again. And so really cool, nifty tool that I would look at if I were you, if you run anything like that. So our next webinar is going to be, and we just nailed this down today, how to make video content your buyers want to watch, featuring Todd Klauser, who just commented. Hi, Todd. Thanks so much. So Todd's an attendee here, but Todd, I'm gonna pump Todd up here a little bit. Todd is the architect of Well.com. Well.com is the biggest manufacturing YouTube channel maybe out there. Todd, you can correct this number for me, but I believe Todd has 550,000 YouTube subscribers, and he has built that over a long period of time. Todd is a YouTube and video freaking expert, and 608. Thank you, Todd. So Todd has 608 YouTube subscribers to Well.com, and we're basically he's going to walk you through his video strategy that he does to have built that large of a following, including how to make video content people actually care about. He'll tell you all the things that companies trip themselves over with video content, and then walk you through a way to get started, because Todd at some point, because Todd, when he got started, obviously wasn't getting tens of thousands and millions at that point views on his stuff. So we'll walk you through that as well. And so I'm really excited to have Todd. I've known Todd for, 5 years now. Todd's more than just someone that we know. I consider him a friend. And so really excited to have him on to talk about video marketing, because he's probably the best in the game that I could think of. So excited to see that. We'll see you guys on January 11th with that at 3 p.m. We'll be back kind of doing it every 2 weeks on a Monday. We thank you guys for sticking with us on this and like doing this kind of revised date. We don't typically like to do this and sort of change dates up. We want to keep something more consistent for you guys, but yeah, really appreciate that. So with that, I want more questions. So if you guys have questions about webinars, about your webinar, or anything you guys want to do, can we there you go, Matthew. All right. So Matthew asked a few strategies to convince our salespeople in the value of doing a webinar and not trying to sell during it. Okay. So I basically, when I try to get my salespeople to do webinars, I just went to them and said, look, we can get in front of your key people in a way that you can show that you know your stuff, and you can build, and you can basically build your own thought leadership. You can build your subject matter expertise. You can build your authority, and this will make selling for you a lot easier. So like, you're not doing the webinar with the intent of selling during it. You're doing it with the intent of making selling down the road for you a lot easier. And so that's how I would convince them to do the webinar. Like, you're doing this so when you go sell, it's a lot easier because you'll have already established yourself as knowing what you're talking about through doing some content, things like this. And so I've done this with people at Binzel, and I've done this with a few of my clients. And so that's how I would convince them. And if they still have trouble wrapping their head around that, I would go find the one champion person in your organization willing to do it with you, and then have them, once they invariably meet success, because they will if you give it enough time and have enough patience, then they'll get that value out of it. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap with anything that you do, that anything that we do in marketing is 1 coin in and 2 coins out. And that's just not how it works. So you're doing this to make things down the road for you easier to do. And obviously you do anything with the intent of driving more revenue, but it's not a linear path, and it's not a 1-to-1 correlation. There's complexities within that happen, but there is a holistic flywheel kind of effect to it. And so that's how I would pitch it to them. I would just say, look, we're not doing this to sell. We're doing this to convey value. More people will come as a result. You will get in front of more of the people that you want to get in front of by doing it. And then when you go and call on them down the road, it will be easier for you to sell to them. And so that's how I would pitch them. I hope that was a useful answer for you, Matthew. Thank you for the question. All right. Can you include a link to your templates in the follow-up email? Yes, Craig, we will include links to our templates in the follow-up email. Jeremy, you got that, man? Yes, we will include the link to the templates in the follow-up email.
I think we need to give Jeremy a shout out. So Jeremy is our newest member of the strategy team, and he does a lot of work helps us a lot with the promotion and the post-production. So he definitely deserves a shout out. Jeremy Conzen, you're the man. He's doing most of the work. We just show up and talk.
You just show up and yammer. Yeah. But anyway, I'm not seeing any more questions rolling. So first off, I want to wish all of you guys happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, which is currently ongoing if you're Jewish, and have Merry Christmas next week. So really appreciate you guys' time and spending time with us. We hope you guys find this valuable as usual. And we're just really thankful you guys are willing to spend this amount of time with us once every couple of weeks. Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. Thank you, Craig. Appreciate it. And we'll be back on the 11th of January with the video marketing. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Happy holidays to you as well. And if you have any questions on webinar, you don't have to just, do this and then run it. If you want to reach out to myself or to Julian on LinkedIn or like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Do you mind sliding this by me and just give me your opinion on it? Please do. This isn't like office hours for us. I'm willing to talk about this stuff with you guys at any point in time. I just like talking marketing, and I like talking and helping people through their problems. That's definitely just where I get the most satisfaction. So please reach out if you're thinking about doing this for yourself for next year. Anything I can do to help you all, I'd be happy to try to. All right. Thank you all so much for listening. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys. See you soon.